Welcome to the Evolution Partners podcast, where I talk with the world's leading thinkers, planners, and doers who are helping to build great companies in their own way. We learn how the work they're doing is creating an impact and get to know a little bit more about them and what makes them tick. This episode is brought to you by Evolution Partners, where we help leaders to confidently build enduring great companies using our proven, structured, strategic planning process that ensures you build and execute the right plan. Check us out at evolutionpartners.com.au. Also, you can check out our books, Made to Thrive, outlining how to be a great CEO, as well as Onboarded, which is about making your new hires more effective faster. This episode is the second of a two-part discussion I had with Burlingham, former executive editor of Inc. magazine and author of several books, including Finish Big, How Great Entrepreneurs Exit Their Companies on Top, as well as Small Giants. He's a big believer of businesses being able to thrive, focusing on both profit and positive social impact. I hope you enjoy the episode. So let's change gears to Small Giants.
Okay.
So there is the original Small Giants and then the 10th anniversary edition. I was fascinated at the difference between the two. Why,
Yes.
as an author, what do you learn? What changes between the first and subsequent editions? It's what you learned when your metaphorical baby hits the world, right? And in the 10th anniversary edition of Small Giants, you introduced a new section, Chapter 7, which is How Small Giants Fail. And this is fascinating because this is the ideology. You don't need to do what the world tells you. There is another path that you can follow, which is that of a small giant. But then, 10th anniversary edition, How Small Giants Fail, learning from the experience. So you concluded that to be successful over the long term, the company has to have and maintain three things. Number one, steady gross margins that it protects. Number two, a healthy balance sheet as reflected in the current cash to debt and debt to equity ratios, among other measures. And number three, a sound business model governing how the company delivers value to customers and earns a profit in the process. As I read that, it takes me to the previous question where in magazine, Bernie told editorial staff that the reader was a business person who uses both sides of their brain. Also, it makes me think about my lived experience where some leaders are more focused on the numbers and others on the culture or softer side. But you need both to succeed and endure, right? Please tell us about your journey to this realization on the financial needs of small giants to endure and how this might apply to listeners in their own businesses.
Well, I can do that. Basically, what happened was, I'll tell you the story of how I came to realize that seventh chapter was critical, and that, now I tell everybody, whatever you do, read the 10-year anniversary edition, because it's very important. I had missed it. I had been, I was caught up in my enthusiasm for the companies that I was writing about. And I thought they were all wonderful. And I wrote Small Giants about what it was that they had in common. And I felt what a great group of companies these are. Well, the book came out in, I guess, 2000, and I was trying to stay in touch with each of the companies that I had written about. And there was one company, a company called Rael Precision Manufacturing, which was a company that was very successful and, in fact, dominated. When you have a laptop computer, when you open the top, it doesn't fall right down. It comes down slowly. Well, that's because of something called a constant torque hinge. And this company, Rael, had understood this need and had been approached obviously by computer companies that were coming out saying, we have to have this ability in a computer. And so they had, developed this constant torque hinge, and they were very successful with it because everybody needed it. If you were making a laptop computer, you had to do it. You had to have it. But then something happened. Well, I'm not going to go ahead because I'll go back. So I wrote about them, and they also were a wonderful company in other ways in terms of the way they treated their people and in terms of the role that they played and sort of the sense of obligation that they felt to both their customers and their employees. And that's what I wrote about in the first edition. After it came out, this was a company that was funny. It had two CEOs, and they're both really nice people, and I liked them both. And after the book came out, I was calling around to some of the companies. I tried to reach the two CEOs at Rael, and I finally wrote something to one of the two CEOs. I got a message back saying he no longer works here. He can be reached at this address, which was obviously a personal address. And I thought, well, wait a minute, what happened? He was the CEO. And I called the other CEO, who basically filled me in. He said that the founders of the company who had been on the board of directors had left, and the people who were still there were not founders. In fact, in most cases, they weren't even business people. But they, excuse me, they had decided that the company needed new leadership, and so they had brought somebody, or they had promoted somebody who in the company to be the new CEO, and said that the old CEOs were going to have to report to him. Well, this didn't go over too well necessarily with the two CEOs. One of them actually was older, and he was ready to retire anyway. The other one was younger and felt that this was wrong and didn't think that the new CEO was any better than he was. And so he resisted this and finally said, I cannot work for this company if you're going to do this.
Yeah.
And he left. Now, I thought, well, gee, this is an important story. I got to write about it. I mean, here I presented this picture of them, which frankly is clearly not accurate in the book. And I was working at Inc. magazine then, and the editor was happy to have me go off and write a story about them and basically tell what happened. Sort of Paradise Lost. And so I started to make some inquiries, and they said, no, we can't talk to you now. This is all in the courts. Basically, this one person is suing the company, and the company is suing him, and until this gets cleaned up, nobody can talk to you. And I said, okay, I'll wait. Well, eventually all that legal stuff got settled, and so the path was open for me to write about what had happened. And what had happened turned out to be something very interesting and educational, at least for me. It was that the company had started out selling its constant torque hinges to American companies. But American companies, which had been American and Japanese companies, which had been producing them in the U.S. and Japan, had decided to move their production to parts of Asia where the labor was much cheaper. Suddenly, the people that they were dealing with were not American companies anymore. And not only that, the people who they were buying from were local people, other people in China or Vietnam or wherever. And those people would make, they could re-engineer the constant torque hinges, and they could make them much cheaper. And so the guys at Rail Precision said, well, what are we going to do? We can't just give up this business. We'll have to lay off 30% of our workforce if we do that. And so they said, well, no, we got to keep everybody employed. The only way we can deal with this is that we have to match them on price. We can create a better product, and then we're going to have to bring the price down. Well, what happened was that, and so they managed to survive on that. The only problem was they weren't making money. When I went to visit them to find out what had really happened, it turned out they were making more constant torque hinges than ever before, and they were losing money on every single one of them. And Obviously you can't run a business that way.
Yeah.
And so it turned out to have a happy ending because there was another person who came in and who understood what was going on and made the right decisions and was able to keep the company alive and turn it around. But that took a long time. I mean, that took years.
Yeah.
So that's where I came up with the first one, which is you need to have gross margins. That's the difference between sales and the actual products, the COGS, the cost of goods sold.
Yeah.
And that had to be big enough to basically pay for all of your overhead and also give you a profit above that. And the problem that lots of small companies and growing companies get into is that they get into a very competitive situation. One way that they can compete is to drop their prices. But that can be a mistake and can lead to real problems.
Yeah.
So that's where I came up with the first rule, which is you need to have gross margins that support the company and you need to protect them. You can't just decide, okay, we're going to reduce our prices. You can do that, but you're going to go out of business.
Yeah.
So that was the first one. Then I found out that there was another company that I'd written about in the first book that I really love. It was a computer special effects company, a great one called Rhythm and Hues. And they had done special effects for all these great movies, like the story about the pig in the city, Babe in the City, and The Life of Pi, which won Academy Awards. This was really an extraordinary good company. And I found out that they had actually won the Academy Award for Life of Pi a week after they had been forced to file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy.
Oh, that's so tough.
So I said, well, wait a minute, I missed that too. And I went and talked to them. There's actually, for people who are listening, if you read Small Giants and you're interested in that story, there is actually something on YouTube called Life After Pi, which is the story of the demise of Rhythm and Hues. And, the irony was that, again, as with the first one, the reason why they got into so much trouble was the CEO, John Hughes, the industry changed. And production of films was not just in Hollywood anymore. It was all around the world. And often, if they would produce if the movie production was happening in Vancouver, say, or in London, part of the deal would be that they would have to hire local special effects companies. Well, again, they got squeezed, and that's where I came up with another one of these rules, which is that you have to recognize, you have to have a business model that's going to allow you to thrive, and you have to recognize that may change over time, because if the environment changes, then your business model may have to change.
Yeah.
And then I had a third one. I may be going into this too long, Brad, but there was a third one. It was a company that wasn't in the first Small Giants, but could have been if I'd known about it. And they got in trouble because they took on too much debt, and they couldn't afford. The company couldn't afford to couldn't survive.
Yeah.
And still pay down the debt and pay the interest on the debt. It had to be restructured. So that was the third one that I came up with.
I love the rules because it's a really simple set of benchmarks that companies, any small to medium companies,
right,
can look at, adhere to, and contemplate their weaknesses against.
Yes. Well, the rules, I think, actually apply to companies of any size.
Yes.
You can look at, Peter Drucker, the great business writer, used to say he loved Inc. magazine, and he did all kinds of nice things with us. And one of the things I heard him say once, he said, who do you think in these big companies, who understands cash flow? None of them understand cash flow.
That's so true.
And you know, if you don't understand cash flow, basically, if you get to a point where you don't have enough cash to pay your bills, then you go out of business. That's very simple. You got to keep paying the people who you owe money to. And if you can't do it, then you're going to have to go out of business. And that applies to companies of any size.
Yeah, that's good. So let's switch gears again to people. You've said that the term small, in regards to Small Giants, the title of the book, isn't defined by revenue, because we think small, we think, oh, it's a small company, 10 million, 20, whatever. It's not defined by revenue, but by the number of employees that a company has, so that it can remain at what you call human scale, where it's still possible for the CEO and owner to meet with new hires and to have a personal connection with everyone in the organization.
Right.
Therefore, if I want to retain human scale, but I want to improve, perhaps the path to getting better might be focusing on revenue or profit per employee. What are your thoughts on this?
My thoughts are that I've learned a lot of things since I wrote Small Giants. And in fact, the book that I'm working on right now includes companies that are much, much larger, but have, in fact, been able to maintain an atmosphere. I wouldn't necessarily call it human scale, given their size. I mean, we're talking about, you know, a company like Enterprise Rent-A-Car, which is the largest rental car company in the world, because it owns both National and Alamo. And, you know, so we're not talking about human scale in that way, but there are things that they do to keep that spirit alive.
Yeah.
When I was writing Small Giants, I had to deal with the question of size, and I realized that these companies were able, you know, there's human scale and then there's financial scale.
Yeah.
And human scale is a company where, as you just described it, Brett, where everybody can have a personal contact with everybody else. And then financial scale is really when you get to a point where that's not possible, and that in fact you have to organize the company in a way, in a different way. And I didn't realize at the time I wrote Small Giants, I didn't realize that there were the number of companies of actually fairly large, some cases fairly large companies that were able to do that.
One of the CEOs that we work with, Craig, he tells a story about his first company, how he got to a scale and there was a tipping point where he would walk into one of the offices and he didn't know the people's names. And second time around, he said, I never want to go back there again. He says, so everything, the model and everything has to be engineered around this. And one of the books that we get all of the teams that we work with to read is Small Giants, to give that perspective. And it deeply resonated with him because he's been on that journey of what you call human scale, where there's quite a lot of intimacy or personality that's lost in that point. So that is a great segue into your current project, your upcoming book about, I think, Dave Wharton and what you call evergreen companies, those that are built to endure. Can you tell us about this project and what you're learning? Because I imagine the learning would have been fascinating.
Yes, absolutely. That's exactly right. This actually was an organization that I heard about through the Small Giants community, because one of the founders of this group called the Tugboat Institute had come to Small Giants and told us about a conference they were having and seeing if there was anybody in the Small Giants group who wanted to attend that conference. And there were, in fact, a few people who decided to go to this other conference as well as the Small Giants Conference. I was very curious about it because this was the way he described these companies. They were very similar to Small Giants. They had many of the same values as Small Giants, but they weren't small. Some of them were very, very large. The other thing, and it was very focused on companies that were basically, as you said, were built to last forever.
Yeah.
There's one company in this institute which is 300 years old. Now, it traces its history back to when it got a permission from the Massachusetts Bay Colony, what's now Massachusetts, to set up a factory that made paper, because at that point paper was always had to be imported from England. And so that's where it started. Now, that's obviously not what it's doing today. It has evolved over the last 300 years.
Yeah.
And, today what it makes is filters, very, very high quality filters that are used and needed in things like spaceships and electric vehicles. In other words, their products ultimately wind up in SpaceX and Tesla, whereas in the beginning, they were selling to people like Ben Franklin. So this is a company that went from Ben Franklin to Elon Musk. And that's quite a journey, and the idea is that throughout this journey, they have maintained certain ways of doing business. They have something called what they call the 7 Ps. And they had to come up, they got this guy, they came up with this concept of companies that were being built to last forever. These were also companies that were not accepting any venture capital and were not accepting any private equity. These were all privately owned companies that had certain characteristics in common. And the characteristics were called the 7 Ps. They were pretty much in this order. Purpose. These were all companies that had a strong sense of purpose of why they were in business, why they deserved to be on the planet, basically. Second, companies that were in it for the long, long haul. They were perseverant. So the second characteristic was perseverance. The third character was these were all companies that really valued their people very highly, and they were what we would call people-first companies. These were all profitable companies because, if you're not profitable, you're not going to last very long. It's also that profit is really an indirect measure of how customers view your product or your service.
Yeah.
The fifth one was that these were all private companies, which I mentioned, so that's another P. Then the next one has to do with the way that they innovate, which is very different from the way innovation happens in Silicon Valley, for example.
Yeah.
This innovation is what they call pragmatic innovation, and it involves, there's a whole approach to doing it, which is very different from the approach that is used in a place like Silicon Valley. And then there's also something about how they grow. These are not companies that grow very fast.
Yeah.
But, a company in Silicon Valley, for example, the emphasis is all on getting big very fast. That's because of the financing that they receive. The venture capitalists have a fund. That fund comes from other people who invested their money and who the venture capitalist needs to show a return to. The bigger the return, the better, and the faster the return, the better.
Yeah.
So that's where the pressure comes from. The same thing basically applies to private equity as well. But you can have a company that isn't growing very fast. It may be only growing 10 or 15% a year.
Yeah.
But if you do that for 30 years, if you're a $16 million company, and you do that for 30 years, you're going to be $1 billion company.
Yeah.
So that was the last P. And I found this all very interesting because it was actually being started by a guy who was a venture capitalist. And I thought, wait a minute, how did he get involved in this? And he not only got involved in it, he identified it and he described it and he came up with. And I said, how did this happen? I went to interview him. He had an office at that time in Palo Alto, which is in the heart of Silicon Valley, and he was very passionate talking to me about these private evergreen companies, all of whom had rejected, had made it clear that they would not accept any money from companies like his or the dozens of other companies surrounding his office.
Yeah.
And it was like, well, how did he wind up here? That guy was Dave Warden. And so the book is the story of how that journey happened, how he came from being, in fact, a very successful venture capital, the associate partner at Kleiner Perkins, which is one of the, and the right-hand man to John Doerr, and how did he get from there to doing what is essentially the opposite, and what did he learn along the way? So that's what the book is about.
That's fantastic. You know, as an author myself, the worst question that I get asked all the time is, when is the book coming out? My interpretation of our conversation before is most likely in 2025. Is that an accurate answer?
Well, that would be my best guess because,
yep.
You know, for some reason, publishers require 9 months to bring out a book. And it's like giving birth to a baby. And we are at a point where we have a complete manuscript, and we have an agent who is very enthusiastic about the book, but we don't have a publisher at this point. We're actually beginning the process of looking for a publisher. Once we have a publisher, it will then take 9 months for the book to come out, which it would mean that it would come out in early 2025. Of course, you know, that's something that you also have some choice about the publisher has some choice about when the publisher thinks is the best time to bring the book out. But I think you're right. It'll probably be 2020.
Yeah. So the book that I'm working on at the moment is about building a better business, not a bigger business. So perhaps in line with some of the topics that we've spoken today, that book is years away, but I have a specific question for you. What do you think a better business looks like for you and most of the people that you deal with?
It has to do with the experience of all the people who come into contact with that business. That's really it. I mean, you're going to have problems. I mean, the only people who don't have problems are in the graveyard. As long as they're alive, every business has problems, and there are things that'll go right and things that'll go wrong. But the question is, what kind of an experience are they having?
Yeah.
And that covers everybody. That covers the customers. What kind of experience are the customers having? What kind of experience are the employees having? What kind of experience are the suppliers having?
Yeah.
What kind of experience are the members of the community surrounding the factory or in the area where they're doing business? So if all those people are having a positive experience and you know, they feel the loyalty to that business and they are inspired, and that business inspires the people who work for it, the people who supply it, the people who buy from it, and the other people outside in other businesses who look at it and say, that's the kind of business I want to have. That is possible, and it's being done. It happens. It doesn't happen. It happens one business at a time. You know, you can't build more than one at a time.
Yeah.
And, you know, frankly, it happens one person at a time as well. You know, but that's what it's about, and it's being done. It's done by people who are aware that that's what they're striving for. Now, some people obviously will go into business because they want to be rich, and capitalism allows that. I don't make judgments about those people, but the companies that they create aren't necessarily a company that I or anybody I know would want to work for.
Yeah.
And so, it begins with knowing what it is you want to do. It begins with knowing something that I write about in both Small Giants and in Finish Big, in knowing who you are, what you want, and why. Because it's very important in the exit phase as well.
Yeah.
And everybody's going to exit. Nobody lives forever.
Yeah. Yeah. That really brings me back, because there was one thing that was connected between Small Giants and Finish Big. Finish Big being stories about the people and a message about the people who conclude their entrepreneurial journey on a high rather than depressed or alone and unhappy, whatever it is.
Yeah.
In Finish Big, how entrepreneurs, great entrepreneurs, exit their companies on top. You said there was a common characteristic between the entrepreneurs in Small Giants and those in Finish Big. They were all entrepreneurs with a crystal clear understanding of who they were, what they wanted out of business, and why. And that's what you just alluded to.
Right.
Can you share with us, how do you think they gained that understanding?
By living and thinking. I mean, often it takes bad experiences to find out who you really are.
Yeah.
And somebody like Norm Brodsky, who's one of my co-authors, one of the people I wrote a book with, is somebody who had some very hard experiences. He had a company that he wanted to take up to $100 million. Why he wanted that, he couldn't have told you. It just seemed cool to have a $100 million company. And he succeeded. And then he lost it all. And he went bankrupt. And he had to actually liquidate the company, and he was laying off lots of people, and he was miserable. And when he started another company, he was very clear in his mind that he did not want that one to wind up the same way. He knew who he was, what he wanted, and why, but it was not an easy process to get there.
Yeah.
And maybe it is for some people. I don't know, but I would guess that for most of us, it takes difficult experiences for us to find out what is really most important to us.
Yeah. Yeah.
And when we're basically forced to decide what's most important to us.
Yeah.
But you can look at it from another point of view and saying that that's the wonderful thing about bad experiences, because it helps you to understand who you are, what you want, and why.
Lovely. Thank you. Is there a book that you would recommend for our audience?
Well, I think you're talking about business books, and I am a fan of Jim Collins, but the book that I like best is not Good to Great. The book I like best is a book called Great by Choice, which is more about entrepreneurs. And I'm also a big fan of Christensen.
Clayton Christensen.
Yeah, Clayton Christensen, and all of his books. He's somebody who died much too soon, but he left behind a whole lot of great books. And I think anybody, it's almost like anybody in any field can get a lot from reading those books.
Yeah, yeah. His last one, How Will You Measure Your Life, again, is one of the books that we recommend. And it's a fabulous book. What haven't we discussed that you wanted to cover off today?
I think you've really drained it all out of me, Brad. No, I think that, what you're talking about now, what we've talked about today, this is what I've devoted my adult life to. And it's... The question that I have is, after, what do I do next? And I am turning that over in my mind, and I'm open to suggestions. If anybody wants to write to me with suggestions, I would welcome it. It's very easy to reach me. It's just Bo Burlingham, but that's the point that I'm at, and I don't have the answer to it.
Well, thank you. Finally, obviously, how can people learn more about you and your business is the question. You mentioned Bo at boburlingham.com, or the website, Bo Burlingham.
Right. Basically, I would suggest that people go to either of the other two that you mentioned, smallgiants.org, greatgame.com. These are both actually interestingly, organizations that grew out of books I wrote. And I take a great deal of pride in that because it suggests that people got value out of the things that I wrote.
Yeah.
And if you really want to, what you will get when you go to either one of those sites is different. And the Great Game is really focused on open book management and how you can build a company where everybody in that company knows what's going on and has an effect and can have an impact on what happens. And Small Giants is different. There are a lot of Small Giant companies that are also open book companies, but it's not universal. And I would say that there's a lot of value that you can get from either one of those sites.
Lovely. Well, Bo, thank you so much for your time today and your wisdom, not only on behalf of me, but on behalf of our audience. The journey that you've been on, the impact that you've had in a positive way on entrepreneurs can't be understated globally, because I'm obviously in Australia, not North America. So thank you on multiple fronts.
Well, it's really my pleasure, Brad. There are companies in Australia that are great game companies, and there are quite a few, in fact, and some of them are, in fact, very impressive companies. So that really is a universal thing.
Thank you, Bo. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Brad. Very pleased to be here.
Well, I hope you enjoyed the episode as much as I did. If you'd be kind enough to leave a review for the podcast, that'd be really helpful to other like-minded entrepreneurs, and then we can grow our community. If you want to find out more about our guests, head over to evolutionpartners.com.au/podcast, where you can find show notes and other additional reading. Hope to see you back next week. Until then, keep thriving.